Hi guys, Mr. McDonald here. Um, Today we're going to talk about genetics. And before we get started talking about genetics, I think it's important that we kind of set this up with what we've been talking about. So we were talking in our last unit about meiosis and the production of sex cells, and how at fertilization we get two sets of genetic information, one from our mom and one from our dad. And within those sets of genetic information, we actually have two separate sets of instructions. And the point of genetics is to try and figure out which instructions we're going to listen to. Are we going to listen to what your mother's genes say or what your father's genes say? So that's what we're kind of getting at here today, and what this chapter is about, trying to figure out again which genes we're going to listen to. So all of this started with a guy named Gregor Mendel, thus the name Mendelelian Genetics. It's named after him. All right, so Gregor Mendel, let's get a picture of Mendel here. He lived in 1822 to 1884. So what was going on in the U.S. between 1822 and 1884? Obviously, a big event was the Civil War. Before that, we had the Industrial Revolution starting. And the important thing is I want you guys to kind of keep in mind is technologically what was going on. There were no cars. People were riding around on horses. Obviously no internet, telephones, anything like that. It was a different time. Most people lived on farms. And Mendel spent his time in a monastery because Mendel was a monk. All right, so as we see here, again, he's responsible for the laws governing the inheritance of traits, and that's what we're going to explore. But the picture shows Mendel working with his garden, again, in his monastery, and this was the time period when Mendel lived. And he started working on these laws because Mendel didn't have a lot of other things to do. There's no internet, there's no video games, there's no sports. All the things that we spend time on, Mendel didn't have. So he worked in his garden during the day to get food for himself, and he noticed certain things. And he studied those. And that led him down this road that started what we now call genetics, and earned him the name, the father of modern genetics. All right, so a little bit about Mendel. Again, he was an Austrian monk. All right, and he studied the inheritance, and he really got into pea plants. And he noticed that pea plants had different traits. He noticed that sometimes the pods were wrinkled, sometimes the pods weren't wrinkled. Sometimes the pods were green, sometimes they were yellow. And he was interested in what caused these differences. And what this led to was what he called laws of inheritance. All right, and Mendel's work wasn't recognized until the turn of the 20th century, so long after Mendel's death. So Mendel didn't reap any financial benefits of his work. No one recognized him as the father of genetics back then, but he took careful notes, and after his death, his work was recognized, and people saw what his contributions were to science. And again, there's a picture of Mendel from back in the day. All right, so between 1856 and 1863, Mendel cultivated and tested some 28,000 pea plants. So again, he's out in his garden, and he's cultivating these plants mainly because they need something to eat. That's why he's growing pea plants in the first place. But also now he's curious about how these plants are inheriting their traits, and he's studying those things. Right, what he found was that the plant's offspring retained the traits of their parents. So what that means is he saw that when he had plants and he compared them to their parents, he saw that they had some of the traits of their parents, some from one plant and some from another. It's kind of like when you look in the mirror and you see some traits from your mom and some traits from your dad. You retain some of those traits. And again, what Mendel got into, what he wanted to know, was how we decide and how we're able to see which traits move down to one generation and are expressed and which ones aren't. All right, so, and again, this got into the phrase father of genetics. There we got a color picture of him. All right, so if you ever get to go to Czech Republic, there's Mendel's garden. It's still there, so you can check it out. You can see it's not very big. I can't imagine that's on any of your travel plans. No one's going to be heading on spring break to go see Mendel's garden, but it's still there. And if you ever get the opportunity, you can take a selfie and let me know, and you'll get extra credit. All right. So what did Mendel talk about? Mendel talked about particulate inheritance. All right. He stated that physical traits are inherited as particles, and the reason for that is because Mendel didn't have the technology to know about DNA. Mendel didn't know about genes. Watson and Crick didn't come up with this stuff until years after Mendel. So he didn't know about genes, he didn't know about DNA, he didn't know about nucleotides, he didn't know any of that information. So he used some other terms that we'll see here in these next couple slides that's different from what we talk about because he didn't have all the information that we have today. So Mendel talked about particles, again, because he didn't know about genes, DNA, and all that stuff that we now take for granted. So Mendel did not know that the particles were actually chromosomes. He didn't know that they were DNA. He didn't know about them being made of nucleotides. All right, so he didn't use those terms. All right, just simply because Mendel didn't know. So what Mendel did know was that traits, something he talked about, was a characteristic that could be passed down from parent to offspring. All right, so traits different from a behavior. A trait, again, is something that's passed down. Think eye color, think hair color, easy examples. Think height, passed down. Things that are not passed down are behaviors. Okay, so even though you know how to read, your offspring won't be born knowing how to read. All right, that's not passed down. Traits are passed down, behaviors and knowledge are not passed down. So genetically, we're looking at things that can be passed down from parent to offspring. All right, and heredity was the passing of those traits from parent to offspring. So traits like the noun, and heredity is the verb. All right, that's the passing of those traits. All right, and genetics was the study of the passing of these traits. How do they get passed down? Which ones are expressed? Which ones are not expressed? All right, so how he studied these things and what he came up with are something called genetic crosses. And what genetic crosses are is he examines all the possible combinations of genes, and that's what we're going to get into. The first one is called a monohybrid cross, and that's where we're looking at a single trait. All right, we're going to do a couple different examples of those. All right, so what we're going to do next is we're just going to kind of walk through the creation of a monohybrid cross. So in this case, they're going to look at flower color. All right. There's also more complex ones called dihybrid crosses, where you look at both of them, but we're going to focus on monohybrid crosses for now, where again we're just looking at one single trait. Mono means single, or one like a monorail or a monocle like Mr. Peanut wears. So again, we're just looking at one single trait. And the tool he uses to do this is something you guys have seen before and probably done before. They're called Punnett squares. All right, and this is something that we use to solve genetic problems. It's just a simple square with a line in the middle and then another line going horizontally, and we get 4 boxes. All right, and what we do is we set that up by listing the male gametes on one side and the female gametes on the other. And it doesn't really matter if they're on the side or on the top. That's just arbitrary. It doesn't matter where you put them. All right, so how to make a Punnett square. First thing you do is make the grid, and then you take the genotype. All right, again, these are vocab words that you guys have, and you put parent 1 on the top and parent 2 on the side. It doesn't matter where you put the male or female. The parents are interchangeable. You're still going to get the same results. And afterwards, you fill in the grid. How do you fill in the grid? Well, let's check this out. We take the y over, we bring a y down. We take this y over, we bring the other y down. This y over, this y down, y over, y down. And what we get in the grid is all the possible genetic combinations, all right, or genotypic combinations that are possible. So then we can interpret that. So when we check this out, we can see that we can have a yellow here, a yellow here, a yellow here, and a green here. And this gets into genotypic ratios and phenotypic ratios. So again, those are vocab words, and we can talk some more about those as we do some examples. All right, so I want to stop there today. All right, we're going to do some examples of a monohybrid cross, and hopefully reinforce some of these ideas that Mendel gave us a little bit, and we'll come back to this point. So if you have any questions, please email me, let me know, and we can get those questions answered for you guys, and hopefully move forward with our study of Mendelian genetics.